All right, so I want to talk about Carl F.H. Henry, and then I'll talk about liberation theology, and then we can be done for the semester. So Carl F.H. Henry is not well known amongst evangelicals today, and that's pretty sad in the sense that he is the father of modern evangelical Protestantism. So what happens at the end of the 19th century is the real Christians, right, the Orthodox Christians in the West, they realize we do not agree with what the mainline denominations are saying. So mainline denominations, Presbyterians, Episcopal, Methodists, are all in various degrees starting to, Northern Baptists, accept a lot of the modernist propositions. And you're starting to see wedges. So the problem is, and I've complained about this before, what I hate about the 19th century is you can just say, you know what, here's how all reality works. Boom, and then you get followers, and then utilitarianism, fascism, Marxism, right? Darwinism. You just say these things, Sigmund Freud, and then people just follow them. And then you realize you have no basis for your ideas, and it leads to bad places, right? It's terrible. That's why my friend Kyle Bashirs loves the 19th century, because of that reason. And I despise it because I'll just, I go get a PhD in chemistry and then I'm like, here's how the world works. And people are like, oh, he's a scientist. He must be right. Science, right? Irritates me. So what happens is you have evolution as a theory. Well, a scientist proposes it. It must be true. And so these Christians are like, well, if it's true, what do we do? So there's three options. One, you just say, well, now the Bible's false, and you just go on and you live out your Christianity in some moralistic form, and it leads to Unitarian Universalism, and it dies. Second one is you adapt it to the Bible, and you say, okay, well, evolution is true. How do we understand that in relation to the Bible while maintaining that the Bible is also true? Or you reject it. Those are the three propositions. And every major denomination will deal with this. The Southern Baptists and the Methodist Church of Christ, it will not really be an issue till the 20th century, because those denominations are found in the South and generally amongst poorer, less educated people. And so it's going to hit the educated elite first, which is the Episcopals, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians. And then it'll work its way from there. Pentecostals, it's never an issue. And Pentecostals don't come up a lot because they really don't exist until 1900, around 1900, late 1800s, early 1900s. And so by then, you've already had to make your decision on on evolution, and so they come in really after the issue. Same with inerrancy. Pentecostals are a very young denomination, and so a lot of things that would become issues in other denominations, they don't have to deal with, which I think is refreshing, right? I don't know any Pentecostal that would deny the inerrancy of the Bible. All right, it's not an issue for them, which is a good thing. So, where was I? Fundamentalism. So, the reaction, what you have in the late 1800s is a group of Christians who say, here are the problems that we see that is creeping into the denominations. We need to make a stand for what Christianity is about. And so they have a conference in Niagara, and they develop what are called the 5 fundamentals of the faith. And you have to hold to these 5 fundamentals of the faith in order to be a real Christian. I should remember these off the top of my head, but basically it's inerrancy of Scripture, deity of Christ, imminent return of Christ, a final judgment. I can't remember the other one. But there are things that every Christian that we would know would be like, well, of course, right? They would affirm these things. Salvation by faith, not by works, right? So, but what happens then is these fundamentalist Christians, at first fundamentalist is not what we think of it as today. That will develop in the 1920s. So what happens though is they in the 1920s you have the Scopes trial, which is where evolution is put on trial in the Tennessee schools, and it makes a mockery of religious people. So the fundamentalists basically go underground. They're like, okay, forget you, society, right? You've turned against us, we turn against you. And they just hole up. The other problem is they start to fight amongst themselves. One of the problems that fundamentalists have is, at least to me, this is just Olson speaking, me, Bob Olson, not Roger Olson, as just something that you notice, is fundamentalists are very quick to basically have guilt by association. So, and I mentioned this earlier, I think it was an earlier lecture, where they will double down on the King James Bible because the people that are liberal happen to not use the King James Bible. So then they go, that Bible must be liberal because that liberal guy uses it. Therefore, the King James is the only Bible I can trust. All other translations are liberal. That's a very bad way to operate because you didn't analyze the text for yourself. You didn't do due diligence. The same thing comes in with clothing, music, what you can and can't do. And what you notice with fundamentalism, and this is the fundamentalism you see today, it focuses on externals. So how do you know if somebody's a Christian? Well, you can't prove it, but certainly they're not listening to rock and roll. They're using the King James Bible. Women are not wearing pants and shorts, right? You start to focus on externals, which is, in my mind, always bad because that turns to legalism. So what happens then is, in the 1940s, Carl F.H. Henry says, hold on a second, because the fundamentalists always fight against each other, right? They're always like, our church is better than yours because you allow your women to wear skirts that only go 1 inch below the knee. Our women, their skirts go 3 inches below the knee, right? Very, very antagonistic, very angry at the culture, railing against the culture. And Carl F.H. Henry says, wait, we need to be salt and light in the culture. So Carl F.H. Henry operates with the presuppositions of the fundamentalists in the sense that Bible is the Word of God, right? He says that has to be the starting point. And he starts to point out all these other views have their own presuppositions. Christianity is the only one that actually can answer all the questions properly or in a way that actually is livable, which I agree. So Carl F.H. Henry and Billy Graham basically create modern evangelicalism because they recognize we need to interact with the culture while maintaining our faith in the Bible and being like a doctor to the culture. That's the analogy that I like to use because Christianity looks at culture, examines it, and then points out the problems with it and gives the solution. That's why whenever you have modern churches who basically tell society what they want to hear, they have failed in their mission, and all they have become is a mirror. Oh, what's that you say? Oh, gay marriage? Oh, yes, we approve gay marriage. I'm like, that's not what the culture needs to hear, right? You're undermining the whole entire gist of the Bible if you're going to take God's ideas of complementary opposites and then just say, no, that's not really important, right? So that's why I always say the moment that your church turns away from a clear reading of the Bible and what has been held for 2,000 years, and then says, oh, what's that? The culture says that? Oh, well, we want to love them. We don't want to offend them. You are no longer serving as the purpose what the church is supposed to do. All right? The church is supposed to analyze the culture and show them where they're wrong, not tell them that they're right when they are wrong, right? And the moment you do that, you're done. Your church in 20 years will just completely go down that slide. And why do I say that? Because as a church historian, it's what happens over the last 200 years since Schleiermacher. It happens every time. The only exception, Southern Baptists in the 1970s, because they had a mechanism within the Southern Baptist Convention that could actually twist it back to a true conservative perspective. So Carl F.H. Henry and Billy Graham are very influential, especially Carl F.H. Henry on the theological front in creating modern evangelicalism. So we owe a debt of gratitude to Carl F.H. Henry. And Billy Graham was like the main prophet of it, right? He's going around preaching the gospel to all these people. So the last thing I want to turn to, though, is what's called liberation theology. And a lot of parts of liberation theology will sound very familiar to you. Because what happens is this comes out of the 1960s. And the real beginning, when you really see this lived out, it takes place in Latin America. So in the 1960s, you have communism spreading around the globe, and you have various Marxist uprisings in poorer countries. Cuba, right? You see it in Cuba. And in South America, you have a lot of people who are tired of living in poverty, while you have a ruling class who have everything they could want and seem to just be exploiting the poor. So you have a guy by the name of Gustavo Gutierrez, late 60s, early 70s, is the main name associated with liberation theology. And what he is saying is, he looks around, he's a Catholic priest, and he says, the Catholic Church doesn't seem to oppose this. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church seems to side with those who are in power, and they turn a blind eye to the poor. So Gustavo Gutierrez says the church needs to be concerned with the poor first and foremost. And the problem is, liberation theology takes a lot of ideas from Marxism, a lot of parallels, and brings them into the church. Now, I do not treat all forms of liberation theology as Marxist, but there's a lot of parallels. One of the main things of liberation theology is sin is oppression. And so salvation then would be getting rid of oppression. So the poor people have a special, closer relationship to God than rich people. And the gospel is for them, but then the gospel really is getting them out of poverty. It's kind of like the social gospel of Walter Rauschenbusch in the 1890s and 1900s, kind of played in a Catholic setting in the 1970s. And so the problem is, a lot of these liberation theologians have no problem or do not speak out against Marxist coups, because they feel like at least now the poor people will have something. So of course the governments don't like these liberation theologians, because they're indirectly or directly supporting uprisings against the government. So the Catholic Church orthodoxy, hierarchy, never supports this. They never give this a firm thumbs up. But what happens is, this idea of liberation theology goes from just dealing with the poor to all marginalized groups. So for example, you have black liberation theology, where all of theology now has to be rethought through the lens of the oppression that has been done on black people. So what does salvation look like? Getting black people no longer oppressed, right? So again, it's undermining the classic view of salvation is getting people in the right relationship with God, right? Confessing your sin. Well, now the sin is the system that is keeping these people oppressed, which is why this sounds familiar today, because this is really postmodernism at its beginning. Does not care about facts, as it doesn't care about orthodoxy. It just says, where's a marginalized group? Okay, sin is whatever structure is keeping them marginalized. So you see, feminist liberation theology, right? That is where you have theologians who say Christianity needs to be reorganized so that its main concern is helping women get out of oppression. So you see that the true gospel is really lost in these liberation theologies, because it's changed the gospel to freeing people from their oppression, whatever that oppression is. Which is again why it sounds so familiar today when you see, for example, if you would listen to something like Black Lives Matter and look at the things they're saying, you'd go, wow, it sounds a lot like black liberation theology. If you look at how people look at let's say the Equality Act that they're trying to pass in Congress, it's very much like liberation theology. We need to help the oppressed classes, which is the LGBT community, and we have to help lift them up. All right? It is not based on fact, in the sense that facts are not important. And one of the things you'll notice about postmodern theology, just like postmodernism, is facts are irrelevant. Because postmodernism doesn't even really believe in objective facts. Postmodernism does not have the same presuppositions as modernism, which is we believe there's an objective truth out there. This is why you have people today say, that's my truth. And you would say, well, but there is truth and there's not truth. Well, but if I believe this, that's my truth, and you can believe something else, that's your truth. And anybody who thinks about that for a moment goes, wait a second, how can we ever have real unity here? Because you're saying that two people can have totally different views of what the truth is. So that's what's happening in liberation theology, is it's focusing on these classes that we see a lot of today. So again, it's going to lead to that, or at least certainly parallel that in a lot of ways. So and again, the problem with liberation theology is they've changed what the gospel is. The gospel is no longer making man right with God. It's how can we get this marginalized group to no longer be marginalized? And you could argue that certainly the gospel is helping people who are in an impoverished state. But the problem, though, is the means by which you do this, right? The liberation theologians usually, it was by any means necessary, right? Well, if people had to die in order to facilitate this, that wasn't necessarily the worst thing. Certainly they didn't go around, at least most of them did not promote violence. But it really has with it a lot of ends justifying the means, which of course is problematic. So that's really the last thing I want to talk about. You'll notice there's some other people in here. Jürgen Moltmann and Wolfhart Pannenberg have a whole section in here. Theologies of Hope. You can read them on your own. They have their own little niche there. But anyway, I think this is it, and I can post these, and then you can get your final papers in. So thank you for this class, coming and listening, and if you watch these videos, for suffering through these, and hope you have a great Thanksgiving and Christmas.